All right, there we go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Absurd Podcast, episode 4. And this time I have as a guest Pragmatic Culture to talk about God, as I did want to talk about for quite a while. Me and Pragmatic, throughout last year and a half, has been debating about God quite a lot. So I wanted to have this more casual conversation talking about what actually Prag believes and trying to pick his brain to understand his point of view on God and what he thinks God is and the essence of God. So, hello, Pragmatic.
Hello! How you been?
Yeah, I've been good. It's been dealing with the corona, God's wrath. The seventh seal has been broken. And the end time is upon us.
And of course, he has punished the Nordcucks most severely, so we know he is just, truly.
Well, just the Swedes, that is, not the rest.
Just the Swedes, that's true.
Yeah, we are cucked. But we're not gonna talk about that now. But do you believe this is a sign from God?
Me personally, no. This is just something that happens every now and again. It's somewhat funny because I remember seeing at the beginning of 2020, people were talking about, there were memes somewhat along the lines of, there was some major pandemic in the 1820s, there was the Spanish flu, and then the 1920s, and then 2020 came along, and everybody was like, oh, what's going to happen? And then, lo and behold, something happened. So it was almost prophesized by the memes more than anything.
That is true. I remember I had the reason why I'm asking is because I had a conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses, and they love to point out that this is the sign of the end.
They really think so?
Yeah, they do. Because they believe in the end there will be, the four horsemen. There will be war, there will be plagues. It's sort of a sign.
Oh, like very literal translation, or very literal, taking the meaning of Revelations, very literal, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's their point. Again, that's why they also focus on 144 people from the tribe, like the tribe of Israel, are only allowed to go to heaven. But that's the funny thing about the Jehovah's Witnesses is they kind of ignore a lot of revelations, but they choose what they want, like the 144,000. Because they believe that the 144,000 is going to rule together with God on the new kingdom of heaven on earth.
Yeah, it's very strange what certain sects will choose to pick and believe, especially about Revelations. I was told in Catholic school very much that it was not to be taken as some sort of a apocalyptic warning. And I believe one of my religion teachers had told me was that it was it was sort of like a description of the Mass in some sense. I didn't get too much into it because I wasn't very interested in the time, but I imagine there's a lot of symbolism between the Book of Revelations and the certain ways in which the Catholic Mass in particular is conducted. I wouldn't know the specifics of that, though.
No, I have no clue about that either, to be honest.
There's 8 million Jehovah's Witnesses just in the United States, so not everyone's getting saved, I guess.
No, they're not. So what they believe, and it's kind of weird, 144,000 will rule together with God on, rule the kingdom of heaven. Well, no, sorry, the kingdom of earth. Its earth is going to be destroyed, and then it's going to be into the kingdom. Anyone who believes will stay alive and be on the earth. 144,000 will rule, and the rest will serve under the kingdom. And if you don't believe, you vanish, you die.
Sorry, go ahead.
Which I found very amusing and kind of relaxing, because then it doesn't matter if I choose Jehovah's Witnesses or not, because I've already accepted the faith of complete blackness when I die.
I'm not I'm not quite sure that's how it works, but I think there is something to it is somewhat conflicting, I suppose, just in the sense that, obviously hell is real and, you know, if you die, you go there and you get tortured for all of time. But then there is also a point in which God says time ends. And so at that point, you cease to exist entirely. But what is all of time versus the end of time then? It's an interesting discussion, I suppose.
Yeah, the infinity. But so you mean that actually after infinity, after time, there will be nothing?
Yeah, it's sort of, at least that's what I've been told. At least that's how I've read it as. I don't know. Again, I'm not particularly autistic in my dissection of certain scripture verses, so I could, of course, be totally misinterpreting that. But it sort of seems like it's saying, once you've sort of made the decision and you go to hell, and you're tortured there and you're there for all of eternity because that's the decision you've made. You then, at some point, God just says no more hell, and then hell and time itself ends, and we're with Him forever in the beatific vision. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but then, well, if time ends and hell ends, and then you stop existing, what is all of time exactly? And maybe in my mind, as I'm thinking about it out loud, it might just be something along the lines of, hell stays sort of quarantined, I guess you could almost say, in this little zone where time continues to exist and they stay there, whereas those who have found unity with God again by choosing to go to heaven end up moving on to some other kind of existence or something like that with Him, like beyond time itself. And so maybe it's not that time ends, but you're just condemned to time, whereas everyone else moves beyond it. And so time doesn't end. It only ends for those in heaven because they've moved beyond it or something like that. I don't know. This is a lot of conjecture.
Mm. So pretty much regardless, if you are alive, if you are living, you're going to live some sort of eternity, more or less eternity. Quite a long time, so let's call it eternity. In some place or another, yes?
Yeah, in some way or another, it'll be either eternity separated from God or eternity with God, one way or the other.
So then women has quite a lot of responsibilities on whom they bring to earth, because this easy slip up causes eternal pain or damnation to a baby.
I mean, it's not so much that they have. I mean, yes, everybody has a responsibility for who they bring in to the world, obviously, but it's also along the lines of, what you do once the lines are there. Because, having the life be born is one part of it, but then leading, that soul to heaven is obviously also very important, because as a parent or as any leadership a figure, really, you're responsible in some sense for the salvation of those under you. And so that's, if you are a leader, that's one of the ways you get judged when you finally die. Like if you're a parent and you die and your kids are like, it looks like your kids might be going to hell, or you didn't do a good enough job in trying to lead them down the right path, you get judged based on that. Like, are your kids going to heaven or not? Were you a good spiritual role model for them? It's one of the many factors, at least.
Yeah, so a 16-year-old girl who made a dumpster baby is gonna be judged eternally by God because.
Yeah, well, if she just kind of leaves the kid there, and just that's well, I mean, I think that's murder anyway. Like, even though I mean I would consider it as such, but I think even legally in like most Western nations, if you have a baby and then just leave it out like
Oh yeah,
that,
yeah.
I'm pretty sure
If
that's
it's
murder.
out, it's murder. That's correct. But still, but I'm
Yeah,
thinking.
you get judged pretty harshly for shit like that.
So where and also quick. how do you believe that the baby in the womb also counts as a life? So let's say a 12-week-year-old baby would also count. So if you do a late-term abortion, for example.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely from the moment of conception type of guy, I would say. So the second, my definition of like, when the soul enters and when personhood begins is sort of life. And so once you get the zygote and the cells start to multiply and it actually starts, and it has demonstrated all the, I forget whether it's 6 or 7 signs of life that you go over in biology or so. Once then it is a life, then it is a human life. It has a soul.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, but then again, it comes back. Like I'm just thinking. Then again, a 16-year-old girl did a whoopsie poopsie, has a abortion after 8 weeks, and she will burn in eternity for all of infinity. Do you think that's a just God? Is that a rightful God to damn her?
Well, I mean, you get the chance to repent. Obviously, that's like a pretty horrible offense, but you can seek forgiveness for that, obviously. It's not like, oh, you did the one crime, then, you're screwed forever. There's obviously penance which you can go about achieving through a number of different ways and things like that.
Should I do the Calvinist Michel Kaplan way and just say, as long as I fully believe in God, and I'm really, really, really sorry that I did what I did, I will go to heaven?
I don't want to... Yeah, that's not quite it. I mean, that's part of it. Obviously, you have to come to terms with why what you did was wrong, and part of that is understanding, well, hey, there's this eternal creator above us who created the life that I killed, and he had a plan for it that was kind of preempted. And so part of like understanding why you're wrong is understanding that. But there's also, further actions you can take, at least in the Catholic form of penance, where it's like, you see in the movies like The Godfather and such, you go to the priest. Was there a confession scene in Godfather? I haven't actually seen it.
I haven't actually seen it myself either, so I don't know.
I know in a lot of mob movies, there's like a confession scene where like a mob guy goes, you see him go into the booth and say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. A part of that afterwards, it isn't just you get absolved. A part of that isn't, stereotypically you hear the priest say, go say a couple Hail Marys, go say an Our Fathers, something like that. But I mean, depending on what it is, priests just won't do that. A lot of them will actually say, like, if you go into a confessional and say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, I killed a guy, or like I murdered someone, the priest will say, all right, well, for your penance, if you really want to be forgiven, you have to go confess to the police, and you have to go own up to that, and go get arrested and face the criminal process and face the guy's family or whatever kin he has left, if you really want forgiveness. So it's more than just the priest saying, I absolve you. There's some action that has to be taken on your part afterwards.
Yeah, repentance, a punishment, in real life punishment for sins. But I mean, wasn't this the concern of the Catholic Church back in the Reformation? That the priests were so corrupt during the back in the day that they just, you give them a little bit of money and they give you a get to heaven free card.
Yeah, that's kind of revisionism. Like, that wasn't quite how it happened. I mean, of course, there are always instances of, like, say, oh, hey, give us money, and, you get time, and I don't think it was like a get to heaven free card. It certainly wasn't that, because that's never how indulgences worked. The way indulgences worked then, and still work now, is that, there are some actions you can take, and, sometimes it is giving money to the church, other times it's, saying a certain kind of prayer, and taking that action is a form of, doing penance for whatever sin you may have committed. And so usually the way it's framed is like, depending on the action you take, depending on what you do, it usually is framed as taking time off of purgatory as opposed to avoiding hell, because avoiding hell and getting time out of purgatory is two very different things. And from my understanding of it, what Martin Luther in particular had a problem with wasn't so much that the indulgences themselves existed. It was just that the church had set the price so ridiculously high for them that it was essentially only a tool by which, like, the princes and the kings could afford these indulgences. And so what Martin Luther really wanted was, lower prices on indulgences so that, the common people could give some money to the church and they could get their own little slice of purgatory, time off of purgatory as well. And so it's kind of been, the scary, mean church version of it that's propagated by Protestants today is sort of like, oh, they were just telling everybody, give us money and you get into heaven for free, when in reality, I don't think that was ever the case.
I mean, I know that Martin Luther didn't want a big reform in that sense. The point of his thesis was just to say, hey, here's a problem. Let's talk about it. Like an academic, more or less he was. But it created conflicts. But it still meant that there were underlying problems for quite a while in the Catholic Church, don't you think?
Yeah, there were certainly... The thing about Martin Luther is, and about the point of, like, his separatism, I think maybe in the beginning that might have been true, but I think after the Council of Trent, like, that narrative kind of goes away because they essentially address everything he's talking about. And in fact, like, there were problems similar to what Martin Luther was talking about before Martin Luther came around. The church is made up of imperfect men, and, there isn't so many sins under the sun. There's only a kind of a finite number that we all just keep falling back into, maybe in slightly different ways. And I mean, in response to the greed thing in particular, there are certain heresies that had popped up, and in response to those heresies, a lot of times there had been certain religious orders that had been formed. So I think there was a heresy, I believe, in southern France and Spain, and it was kind of very much a response to the church's sort of opulence, where it's like, you got the golden altar pieces, the really tall, nice cathedrals, and the really ornate dresses on the priests. And so the people in that region sort of, like, found this heresy and were like, oh, this seems like a much simpler way of life. This seems like what Christ really would have wanted. We'll go do this. And the priests would never have any luck converting those people back because, they'd come in all their fancy garb and whatever. And everybody was like, well, you're not really living like Christ wanted in that way. You're being, like, very, very decadent. And Christ said, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter heaven. And you seem a lot like a rich man with all this stuff. And in response to that, I believe it was either the Carthusians or some other religious order who were like, you know what, these people have a point. And so this order was founded, and they were dedicated more so specifically to the mission of living in poverty and begging in order to receive their, alms and things like that so that they could support themselves. And in a lot of ways, that was the response to a lot of different criticisms the church had, which was, well, here's this different religious order. Let's have them address the concerns of the people and let's have them proselytize to this people where this problem comes up. And the problem with Martin Luther is he kind of didn't choose to do that even from the beginning. Rather than try to address these problems himself and perhaps attract some followers to what he was doing, he kind of jumped the gun and just said, oh no, the church should do what I'm saying right off the bat. And it was sort of a very arrogant way of going about doing it. So even if there were problems at the time regarding the issues Martin Luther brought up, the way he went about addressing them makes it sort of suspect as to what his aims might have really been.
Yeah, there's always memes around his aims of the Reformation. I know I know Lutheran priests who joke about this quite often, and they say one point of the Reformation and why in the end he kind of wanted it is so he could marry and have children.
Yeah. There was definitely... I was listening to, I think E. Michael Jones was having a conversation with... Yeah. But he was talking about, in particular, the conversation kind of went to Hegel, so of course I was like absolutely stoked. But the conversation went to how, and Hegel was a Lutheran himself, and how Luther, when he was first sort of rebelling, he went to the Bishop of Mons and said, if you let this happen, you can have a pick of these nuns who have joined me. And it was kind of like, not quite pimping, but it was sort of like a sexual liberation type moment of the Reformation. And so certainly with these incidences in mind, there is a good amount of question as to what, some of what Luther wanted.
Well, again, I'm born Lutheran myself, but I was never a big part of the Luther concept. Really, I was more part of the personal relationship with God that Lutheranism kind of gave you. That was more my thing. I never cared much about the Lutheran faith or Luther's little book, Catholicism in Swedish. I never cared much of it. So sadly, even though I'm again born a Lutheran, I'm actually one of the worst people to talk about Luther with, because I don't know that much. Like, I know the basics. I know what I was taught in school. I know about the Reformation. I know about all of that. But theology-wise, nah, I'm a pooper when it comes to Lutheranism.
I mean, I think that's the case with most Christians in general, though. Like, I think the specifics of theology largely kind of evade people, and it's, some of it's because they don't take the biggest interest in it, but also because some of it is like, it's very autistic. Like the debates you'll hear someone like classical theist from Twitter have with a Jay Dyer type figure, or anything like that about essence and energy and the Trinity and the filioque. Like that's kind of high level stuff where you need to have a base knowledge, and most people don't even bother doing the base knowledge, which is fine. I don't think, like, for me, the biggest thing about conversion and what I've come to believe is that it's much less of an intellectual experience and more of a spiritual kind of turning your own sort of leaf thing. And in that way, having these arguments is nice. It's good to sort of have perhaps a bit more of an intellectual reasoning as to why you believe these things, so that, on an emotional whim one day, you don't just happen to abandon it, but it's not strictly necessary in all cases.
No, yeah, I get that. But regardless of one's spiritual journey, there's still the facts in place, right?
In what sense?
Like, what I understood what you said is like you need a journey to understand all the concepts, to understand the Trinity and different type of ideas around that.
Yeah, you do. You need it to understand it, but not so much in the sense of a deep intellectual understanding, but to understand it in more the sense of, this is, the nature of God in some sense is reflected in, like, my daily life and in the world around me, in all these different ways. So it doesn't have to be like the understanding of, like, an academic like Thomas Aquinas. It can be very much the understanding of just a lay person, like, oh well, I see how this, aspect of God relates to me and relates to how I ought to live my life, or something like that.
Yeah, and this is for a layman, then you're thinking not theologian.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that I get. That's usually how it goes. In the end of the day, it's the like culture around the theology that makes you follow certain aspects. Again, the reason why I didn't care much about the Luther's book is because the culture around it was still there. The Lutheran Swedish culture is still there. That made me still, my relationship with God when I was a kid was based around the religious culture I was grown up in. So it's a journey, and in that sense, it's true. But I think it's still important for at least religious sort of what's it called, curious people to try to learn more, because the layman, the normal churchgoer, doesn't care much. He just can listen to the priest and that's it. But people like you and me, we explore more, and I think that's important to do.
Yeah, for sure. Especially, like, I think the big problem is, now more than ever, it's because it is a secularized society. You know, the learning about God used to be somewhat inbuilt with the education system at large. You know, when you went to school, you learned, you know, arithmetic and philosophy and literature and things like that, and they all kind of wove back into a theology of sorts. And even the type of books you would read back then were of a different caliber. Like, you know, you'd start with something like the Iliad, where you have this sort of man and gods type of perspective, but there's some aspects of that, even though it's like, you know, essentially pagan, there's aspects of that where you can relate the experiences of like Hector and Achilles back to the experiences of the apostles in some sense, or anything like that. And even though it's a different spiritual framework, the commonalities can still be related to a Christian, just with the, you know, proper monotheistic mindset and things like that. You know, there aren't other than like occasionally when like the high school lit class eventually gets to the Iliad or something like that, you know, most stories today aren't about those kind of struggles that people can internalize. Even though they're big and grand, people think, oh, well, this is just sort of like a part of me. Everything is supposed to be relatable now. And in some sense, that makes it almost less relatable, because it kind of feels fake. It kind of feels like it's being sold to you as this thing that you're supposed to relate to, as opposed to something where, even though on its surface, you know, this is the war between Troy and Greece and the Greek city-states, and, you know, this is something that's like, oh, this happened so long ago with all these, you know, ancient, super powerful characters, some in some cases who were literal demigods. How am I supposed to like understand this experience? You can still take away a little bits of it, like when you know, Patroclus is slain and Achilles weeps and things like that. It's a very much kind of like a moment where, you know, Jesus finds out Lazarus is dead and Jesus weeps and things like that. But now, because, you know, all these experiences are supposed to be real and that we're also supposed to relate to, it's kind of like, well, yeah, I already know this. I already know how I relate to this. It's inherently less interesting to me, and in that sense, it's inherently going to be less of an experience.
Yeah, okay. So
That's a bit of a tangent.
yeah, it's a bit of a tangent, but I want to go back to one thing, and because we were supposed to talk about the nature of God, and you said the monotheistic religion. But Christianity is fun, right? When it comes to monotheism, because everybody likes to accuse you of not being monotheistic.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess specifically Catholics, it's a Catholic sort of thing where, although maybe, I mean, most of the time I hear like the jab, oh, you guys are like polytheists because like you worship Mary and you worship the saints and things like that. And I'll hear that as a jab from other Christians, other than occasionally like I'll hear like maybe the occasional pagan accuse all Christians of in fact being polytheists because of the Trinity or something like that. But usually it's other Christians throwing the jab at me, a Catholic, that I am in fact a polytheist in the way I worship the saints. But no, it is still, yeah, it's not polytheism because you don't worship the saints, you venerate them, and those are two very different ideas.
Fair enough. Again, my point was never the same, because I fully grasp the concept how you can have something that is holy and still not be God.
Yeah,
it would
exactly.
It would be like if a Muslim would say that, because Muslims usually have the arguments against Christians that about the Trinity being polytheistic and not monotheistic. But if you take the saints part, only the saints part, let's say they would use that argument, then he would say, well, then you believe Kaaba, the fucking rock, is a god, because you're going through it every year and you're praying towards it. There has to be some sort of there's like immediately they will say no to that, and it's like, yeah, that's pretty much the same as a saint. It's a prayer too, as someone who has done a sacrifice in the past. It's not that they are God or something like that. They are just something to be to give inspiration to. You should give your time, your prayers towards. If I'm getting it correct.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, like, that's the thing. If you believe that, say a relative dies and goes to heaven, and you ask for them to look over you or something like that, or even if you just like
that's
pray,
common.
even if you pray for the dead, like that's something I think
Most people do. Yes,
but if the idea is, you're asking them then to for you, and suddenly that's crossing the line. Well, if you think they're in heaven and they're right there with God, like I've never understood the issue with that certain Protestant sects have it, because you're not saying they're God, you're just saying that they're there with him, and you're asking them to petition him, especially because of their unique circumstance. But I don't know if that's what you were getting at.
No, I was not talking about the Trinity because God, but let's talk about the saints a bit more and all of the saint worship. There is this, and I kind of understand, like, I can accept this premise a little bit when it comes to why Christians worships or had more of a worship, well, still today, but the traditional worshipping saints became a thing, and it has to do with polytheism, not in the sense that they are gods, but because of the traditions previously, when especially, I mean, the Orthodox have their saints, and they were in many of these areas are very pagan from before, and most of the overall pagan areas that the Orthodox they have a ton of saints. It's sort of a replacement with rituals. It's that the ritual from polytheism back in the day just swapped over to a saint. It's just so you keep some sort of a tribal identity with the rituals that you have, but you just focus on another concept. I don't know your opinion about that.
No, I've heard that brought up a lot before, and there's certainly similarities between the two, because I mean, even in Greece, you had very local gods, like the particular deity of this small river, like this river nymph or something like that.
Yeah.
And then you had Poseidon, who was like kind of like the god of it all. And even there, like obviously Athens had Athena specifically, and Delphi had Apollo specifically because his oracle was there and stuff like that. So it does allow for sort of a continuation of that tribal identity. But
and we do know that Paul worked a lot with the pagans. Like, he tried to mix and match it, not mix and match, not the right word, but he tried to make it easier for the pagans to convert over. So it wasn't, again, certain rituals that they had since before they could keep. So it's like, because it didn't go on full pushy with the law of Moses, they could kind of go over, transist over to Christianity or Jesus worshipping, and keep certain rituals in place. It makes it more gradual until the massacres happens, but that's another point.
Yeah, well, there's certainly something to that, because I know Paul mentions in one of his letters, I forget which one, it's like, the Greeks had a shrine to an unknown god that happened to deliver them from, I forget whether or not it was a plague or something like it, but Paul points out, hey, the shrine to this god that actually did something for you for once, that unknown god, he is this god. I'm telling you, the god that actually did the one thing for you, that's my guy.
Yeah.
And it was sort of a story, but I can't say specifically how, because saints is kind of, the meaning of saint has kind of changed over the centuries, especially from the early church, where a saint was just someone actually believed, and during the reigns of Nero and Diocletian especially,
Martyrdom.
That was something, it was martyrdom itself, and of course that was an act of tremendous faith. And so later on, when reassessing the definition, it's like, well, of course the martyrs are in heaven. You don't just die for Jesus and then not get there. That would seem somewhat odd. But then, there's the whole canonization process now in the church and things like that. But I'm not sure how much Paul used. Like, I know he used the unknown God and said, hey, this is how that God is my guy. But as far as with how he might have converted the rest of Greece, I think, because I did have a conversation with a pagan once, somewhat along these lines, where it's how. Well, yeah, I just happened to run into him. It wasn't. I'm not running into huge amounts of pagans online as of right now, but it was mostly along the lines of how the various natures of these different gods kind of can be subsumed into the one true God. It's kind of like how there was a certain Roman emperor that tried to institute monotheism, and he sort of made a similar case, like the god Sol Invictus or something like that.
Sol Invictus, indeed.
Yeah, and in the end, that emperor in his process was sort of making the same argument, like, hey, all these little gods that we kind of used to have, like, Jupiter and Mars and whatnot, they're all subsumed into this guy's one essence. And I think Paul did sort of something similar with the Greeks for the most part. And then perhaps, once you have, big Eastern conversions, like when you get Cyril and Methodius and those type of folks, that's when you start to, whatchamacallit, that's when you actually start to see perhaps the more local saint tribalness sort of come out again.
Yeah, fair enough. But I'm also thinking, like, throughout the Old Testament, there was a lot of battle with the polytheistic religions. In the same way that Paul dealt with it when he said that your God is actually my God. Because in the sense that if we take the conquest of, like, the Baal fight that they had, the Yahweh versus Baal, and then pour water onto the logs and ask God to smite it. So yeah, that's kind of the same thing. It's like something happened, mine. It's like mine. It's a fight of the polytheistic. But if something would happen with the Baal one, they would still say mine. It's kind of like yes, focus on mono. It's a one concept. So if any God actions happens, it's only can be one. That's the concept in head.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, you'd use that sort of thing to your advantage, but it's like, and I mean, really, it's kind of hard how you pick and choose. I don't know. I'm trying to think of. Are you talking about the competition where, like, they had the altar and, like, they would try to get, which was it? They had all their priests, like, throwing wood on the fire and making offerings, and then, like, the Hebrew guy would just keep soaking his in water to, like, water it down, and then
and then God smited the Hebrews wet thingy, and that burned up. While Baal didn't do anything.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, in specific instances like that, obviously you can say, well, hey, this happened for us and we did it.
Yeah, and but my point is that became a culture thing. It just became something that happened with the Christification of Rome as well.
Oh, yeah, like obviously you get Constantine who says, you get God who says to Constantine, hey, put this symbol on all your shit, and guess what? You'll win the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And then he wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and it's like, well, shit. I guess there's some legitimacy to that. And I mean, that's a legitimate way to convert people, and that's a legitimate way of going about doing it, saying, hey, if you want to know how we keep winning, like in the case of the Hebrews conquering the Holy Land, or in the case of, like, other empires conquering other peoples, it's like, hey, you want to know how we kick so much ass? Come worship our guy. Like, that's sort of a spiritual experience. War is a kind of spiritual thing, so certainly nothing wrong with that in that sense.
No, it's a very common thing. It's usually, the victors. And then you can choose that. Yeah, with the Holy Wars concept as well. It's like, because we won, therefore God.
Yeah.
I obviously personally I don't believe that Constantine had any help from God, but it's just that because he won, they can say God. But again, that's also a thing that Christians love to do. It's when someone dies or is dying of cancer, but he got healed, they say thank God, not thank the doctor. Kind of that. It's an atheistic meme, but it's still there. It's like, regardless of what happened,
Okay.
it's still.
I think I get what you're saying. Like, good thing happens, thank God. Bad thing happens. Oh well, it just happens. That's what you're talking about, kind of.
Yeah, in a way. But we never gotten to the point that I wanted to talk about, which is again the essence of God. So we had a quick conversation back in the day about Summa Theologia. You have read it?
The Summa?
Yeah.
No, not in its entirety.
I don't think anyone has those. That's not really the point if you read it entirely.
I've definitely read snippets of it, especially those particularly pertaining to what I was learning at the time, whether it was how the Trinity works, specific elements of justice, or something like that. And so usually that's how I'll go apart reading like certain text. Like, I'll take what I'm looking for at the time out of it, and I think that's kind of what I've done with the Summa as well.
Yeah, I really love the way I skimmed it myself as well, pretty much as you have done as well. It seems to be because it's a lot, but I do love the way he writes, and I don't agree on his takes because I think they're outdated, which they are. But I do love how he frames it, which gives it's a tool for future research, which was the point. His concept of natural law and a few other things really created a new changed the Western world. Again, Thomas is one of the most important people in the West. A dick, but definitely one of the most important people in the West.
Yeah, no, I'm always I mean, when I hear people like the Amazing Atheist, who at one point said something along the lines of like, I'll be better remembered than Thomas Aquinas in some hundreds of years. It's kind of like,
what? Really? He said that?
He said something along those lines in a video of his. Like, I'd have to go back and find the clip because it was in a Distributist video.
That's silly.
Silly. Yeah, yeah, the gall of it. But I mean, it kind of speaks to a mindset. Like, this is something I think even Voltaire said this. That no one would be reading the Bible in like 100 years, 200 years, something like that. And
they still will.
I mean,
it's gonna take a while. Well, secularism. I can't speak. Secularization of the West and the world will definitely happen. Religion won't vanish. It just changed form.
Shit's pretty secularized right now, and as hard as they've tried to like truly eliminate its whatchamacallit, its influence, it still hasn't happened. I don't think, like, whatever anyone's vision of really is of like a quote-unquote secularized West, I don't think that's going to be happening anytime soon, or even in the future.
Not in what the Amazing Atheist would want it to be, no. For me, I just want, separation. No religious concepts in law at all, if possible.
And also, demographically, like, secularists don't really propagate themselves as much as their religious brothers. Like, for example, I looked at this the other day. Apparently, irreligious boomers, so like people who are boomers but they're irreligious, they are 4 times less likely to have grandchildren. So, and they're not really kind of they're not really going to generationally pass off to their children this.
Yeah, and grandchildren is definitely the big marker. I remember I have some papers here somewhere in regards to like how different competition models between groups, like computer simulated groups with like death and reproduction, and it's like different survival strategies between what was it? There was like 4 groups. There was like I can't even think of it off the top of my head. All I remember was that the big metric on how long you could know a group would survive is not how many children they'll have initially, but how many grandchildren they have. So even if you have only like 1 kid, if they have like 3 grandkids, that's pretty good. Like that's what you want to try to look for. And same with like, you could have 5 kids, but if then only, 2 of them have 1 kid, that's not as good.
Yeah.
And that's something to be said, so long as there's like so long as there are religious people who are having, lots and lots of kids, and at least a decent portion of them stay with the faith, like that's another thing, as long as those people choose to be active, at least to some extent, in the societies in which they live, religious influence, total separation, certainly I don't think will be possible, probably not in the way you envision it.
Well, again, you don't have a choice really much in the matter when it comes to secularism. It's because you don't have the numbers in the end of the day, which is the sad part for you, but sadly how it is. I mean, you'll have the long run as you always had to have. Like the Christians won't vanish, but I think it's because of the numbers game right now, which is weird, because the urbanites are not very religious, and they are the higher numbers than the more people in the outskirts, outside that are usually more religious, but not as many. But they have more kids.
Well, it depends what you mean by numbers, because you could say there's 8 million or so urbanites, and not in like New York or London or something like that. But yeah, I mean, really, like the global numbers, I think for Islam are something like 2 point something billion. I think Catholicism is like 1.9 or 2 point something billion, right around that range as well. And there's a whole bunch of other Christian sects that have like a combined have 1 billion followers or so.
Yeah.
So yeah, sure, you have these hives of modernity and such.
I mean, when it comes to that, both Muslims and Christians has the numbers in the wrong places. Well, same thing with Sunni. Like they have the numbers at the wrong places, because the reason why Sunni has 85% of the part, like 85% is Sunni, 15% is Shia. The reason why they have so many Sunni is because quite a lot of Africans are Sunni, and they are a lot more than the Arabs number wise. So again, the numbers are, but they're not as
religious.
Well, religious, but like spiritual, and go on with the theological spiritual way. They kind of stay there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's certainly something to be said for the fact that, like, one of my big problems with a lot of left Caths, and I don't know if you saw that article floating around on Twitter about how left Catholicism is, going to be, the trendy new thing.
I know that it was a tweet, right, by Bridget. I forgot her name.
Well, it was like there was an article in the Times. I mean, maybe not an article in the Times, but it was on the Times website accompanying it, about how hip Catholicism with like Marxist tendencies is gonna convert the kids, or some dumb garbage like that.
It won't.
No, it won't at all. But I mean, one of the reasons, at least in my mind, is that a lot of them have this contention that it's like, oh, if we just replace the WASPs with like Hispanics, like, well, it's like, well, oh, all the Hispanics are Catholic, and so, that's gonna, that's going to be how we convert, the Western world guys. We just have to replace them with Hispanics, which is like a horrible attitude to have, for one. But two, it's not even true, because if you look at the numbers, for one, nowhere near as many Hispanics as before actually practice the faith, and two, even those that do really just sort of have it as a window dressing. Like, my huge problem with like Catholicism in the Western Hemisphere has always been that, the minority groups, quote unquote, even though they make up the majority of the population of the Western Hemisphere, that practice Catholicism, are the same ones that have, like, massive drug crime, like, massive, like, scandals with prostitution and, crazy corrupt leadership and everything like that. Like, there are literally cartels that will kidnap children and hollow out their bodies so they can smuggle drugs through the United States. And it's like, really, these are the guys you're banking on to be like Catholics and to like re-evangelize, the WASPs? Like, or more importantly, these are the people you want replacing the WASPs? It's like, I'm pressing X to doubt pretty hard right now.
So it's kind of funny. I'm doing a paper now on left Catholicism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm doing a comparison study on liberation theology in El Salvador and then American Catholic movement, Catholic worker movement. But it's mostly out of like national culture and its effect on like why the outcome became so different. Like what was the reasons for both of them being progressive, both of them being very left, anarchistic in nature.
Mm-hmm.
One going to war and the other one being called racist and crazy commie. But the thing with the progressive people in El Salvador is they don't really they don't have the same uncertainty avoidance that Americans have. Because Americans really not think 2 steps ahead, and they think, all right, what can happen if I say this? All right, these people get mad. In El Salvador, because they don't really have that luxury, it's like a man who's part of a gang comes to your city, well, shake his hand. It's like, you don't do that, but they still do that. They don't really think, what will happen if I do these actions here? What will it lead to? It's not that it's short-term thinking or long-term thinking, that's not the point. Because they still have the long-term thinking of teaching and planning and everything, but they whenever conflicts happen, they don't avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of becomes a part. So when it comes to this progressive priest, most of his students became militiamen, like guerrilla warriors. And it's because it's like, all right, here is a concern we have. These radical military group have the same concerns. All right, let's shake their hands. You have no reason to shake their hands, but it's kind of what you have to do. It's just like, this is why a lot of Christians like in these areas, because they don't have the voice, go to like gangs, go to like crime, but like, because they do. They're very on hands in their action.
Yeah, I get that. And I've even started to, whatchamacallit. For a long time, I've always thought sort of like, I've never understood the tendency towards like, these supposedly very Catholic nations to, violent kind of leftism. And eventually, the conclusion I've come to at least isn't so much that it's like, they were tired of the repressive church and they just had to rebel. Because I still think there's an element, that goes a little deeper than just the surface of like the initial Catholicism they were, born with, essentially, that those nations were born out of. It's just that the predominant aspect represented in those nations now is sort of like the Catholic desire for communalism. Because as much as like anarchists today like to go on about, communes and, living in like a co-op lifestyle, it was originally monks in monasteries who lived that kind of lifestyle. Saint Benedict and Ora et Labora and that kind of thing.
And that's why left-wing Catholics becomes anarchistic. They become anarchists. Even though they were communists in the past, they become anarchists. Because of this communal aspect of it. Yeah, you're right.
And it's been, whatchamacallit, it's always sort of been like this sort of conflicting element of it, where obviously they come this way because they want communalism, but, there's the basis that they use for it is, instead of saying, oh, well, Jesus wouldn't mind it if we lived like this, it also becomes the idea of, whatchamacallit, becomes the idea of pure materialism, because of course there is a certain element of rejecting the church, but it's all still within the framework of the church, because it's not simply because they've still adopted certain elements of it, but in this rejection they're still granting it validity. Like, there's nothing these people can do in their, at least political endeavors, that is totally outside the scope of the church. I can't remember where I heard this quote from, but it was something along the lines of, there is truly nothing better than the Catholic Church except to be truly outside the church. And the remark was, meant to be something like, if you're Protestant or, truly very European in your ideals, then it's all a reaction to the church or of the church in some sense. Whereas, like, the comparison being made was to, like, Tibetan Buddhism. This is something that's truly alien, utterly, to, like, the European mind and all European ideals, even if you have someone like Schopenhauer, maybe, that sort of encapsulated some of it. And so to see the conclusions they arrive at and to see how their belief system functions is sort of another interesting, refreshing take, almost, as opposed to sort of like these whatchamacallit, just basic bitch, postmodernist takes or continental takes in general. Another tangent, I'm sorry. But
yeah,
I guess
you go on tangents.
But I guess it's also, you wanted to talk about the essence of God. I guess it'd be interesting to compare and contrast the essence of, God and the Tibetan one. But are there any questions you had specifically on, like, the nature of God or the essence of God or whatever?
So I had some planning. All right. So all right, let me just swap this over here. So I have the Summa Theology in front of me here, and I do, again, the stream can see it now. It's artistically beautiful. Again, I'm glad he made it easy to read. I don't know how the original was, but this is artistically beautiful. Anyway, so I have, because I wanted to also talk about what Catherine talked about a bit, but in kind of chess here. So in the question of whether God exists, there's two objections on whether God exists that Thomas shows.
Mm-hmm.
Objection one being, it seems that God does not exist, because if one of the two contraries be infinite, the other one would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God exists, there could be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. So this one has two concepts in it that I found fascinating. One that Catherine talked about, and then the paradoxical nature of God. So I'm going to talk about those two. We're starting with the infinite goodness. Do you agree that God is infinitely good? Which,
yeah,
you do.
Yeah.
So, what was the Michelle argument was again? Well, I asked Michelle about her being. I actually thought she was a Catholic, by the way. She was not a Catholic. She's a Calvinist. And I asked her about her transitioning, and if that got into conflict of her religion. And she said no, because she asks God for forgiveness for. It's not. She obviously understands it's a bit of a sin, but she asks God for forgiveness, and she knows God is infinitely good and will forgive her if she repents and do other goodness. I think that was
Okay.
I hope it was. And then I went on with the infinite goodness of God. It's like, so as long as I repent into everything I do, as long as I'm really, 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 really sorry for murdering somebody, I can go to heaven. And technically can say yes. And then he said, but you can't judge God through our morals, because God knows what is true. And God is infinitely good. And he knows that if you really, 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 really am sorry for the action you've done and believe in God and believe in the sacrificial lamb, then you will go to heaven. What's your comment on this?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's sort of the clincher, is like, how do you know who's really sorry, and like, how can we tell? And I mean, at the end of the day, we of course can't fully tell, but like I said before, if you murdered someone and you wanted to show that you were really, 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 really sorry, then the priest would tell you, all right, go turn yourself in then. And, that would be a way of showing it. Otherwise, there would be doubts, and, we'd have reason to believe that person perhaps wasn't truly sorry. Again, we can't judge perfectly, but God would know. And then we could say maybe perhaps, well, he didn't actually care that much, so maybe he didn't actually get into heaven, something like that. There'd be reason for doubt. And so,
but
maybe
it's just that how much as I asked her, how much can you get away with? Because
I mean, getting away with it is kind of I think the wrong way of looking at it, because if you're truly sorry, God would tell you, you're not supposed to be getting away with it. At the end of it all, God would say, nothing is precluded from his forgiveness, really. The example, the extreme example being even, someone like Hitler or Stalin could get to heaven, something like that. And so nothing is out of the scope of his forgiveness, obviously. The question is, well, I mean, how can you judge if someone is truly sorry, especially, like, at the end of their life? Because the thing about, when you stand kind of before God, at the end of it all, what I've heard classical theists talk a lot about is the fact that once you're sort of stripped of mortal flesh and kind of, the passions of the body and stuff like that, you are given, clarity in the things that you have done. And at that point, because what's left is your soul, it depends on how you formed your soul about whether or not you'll actually be sorry for the things you've done. And so, depending upon whatchamacallit, the things you've actually done, you'll say, well, I'm not sorry and I'll accept the consequence of hell, or I am sorry and I'll accept the consequence of purgatory for X amount of time to atone for the sins I couldn't atone for on earth. Because, I mean, all things being perfect, God would want you to atone for your sins on earth. And again, in the case of murder, that would be actually confessing to it and facing jail time. As for other crimes, it depend on what the crimes were in order how you'd have to receive punishment for them. But in lieu of punishment on earth, depending on how your soul is formed and what you've done, it'll be an in the moment decision right as you're facing God that we will just never be able to know. Yeah, but all things are within the scope of his forgiveness.
Yeah. But that's more, that is obviously more of a Catholic way than what Michelle would have said, because you believe in a purgatory up until the judgment day, and then you will be judged by God. And in purgatory, you have a chance of also repenting, if I'm correct.
Yeah, purgatory is kind of, it's not hell, obviously, because at the end of purgatory you get to heaven, but at the same time, it's not supposed to be a pleasant place at all. It is a place of sort of like torturing. I believe in Dante's Purgatorio, one part of purgatory sees the souls, like wailing or like crying into like the sand as they're face down saying like prayers or something like that. And so that is also why it's called the church suffering, in the Catholic faith, because we are the church militant, because we're literally fighting the battles to get into heaven and, stop the demons here on earth. And purgatory is like, well, you're going to get to heaven, but you got to suffer first. And so they are called the church suffering. I believe it is we pray for them on All Souls Day, but I believe there's another day in particular on which we pray for the church suffering so that, their time suffering might be expedited somewhat.
So me as a non-believer then would go to purgatory, but on Judgment Day, if I was a good boy and I repented in purgatory, I could go to heaven.
Yeah, so like, if by Judgment Day you mean just, you're dead and your soul is going up. Yeah, if your soul is formed correctly and you realize, well, shit, I was wrong and I'm sorry for it, then yeah, you'd go to purgatory and spend X amount of time there.
If I'm correct, you don't go to heaven immediately in Catholicism. If you're good, you still wait till Judgment Day.
I don't.
Because that's the point of revelation. The point is it's a point for everyone to kind of skedaddle, like die in the end. And Judgment Day will come, and then the good people will be placed in heaven, and the bad people will be staying on earth, suffering, and then they will be taken wherever Beelzebub wants them to be.
Well, I suppose there's kind of two answers to that, which was like what I've kind of grown up to believe, and I could be wrong on this, was just that, you'll enter heaven when you die. It's not like you're waiting for the end of the world to enter heaven. But I suppose on the flip side of that is that if, your soul in heaven is outside of time itself, and Judgment Day is the end of time.
It is. When you die, again, this is why purgatory is such a weird concept for me. Because, I can understand that for sinners, it would be that purgatory which you describe. But for non-believers, it would just be snap of a finger and then it's Judgment Day.
Yeah, well, I suppose there is that part where if you read the Revelations and it says on Judgment Day that, in sort of like the Protestant version of like the rapture and so forth, that at that point purgatory ceases to exist itself, and then it's either, well, even if you weren't a believer, if you were generally good enough, you still get into heaven, and purgatory is foregone because it's the actual end of the world. And then all the bad people stay on earth or go to hell or whatever. I don't know the specific Protestant lore behind the rapture and whatnot, but in terms of what the Catholic Church believes, I do believe it's like, you could consider it Judgment Day because, again, the soul and heaven exists outside of time. But at the same time, like, it's not like you've always been dead, because you haven't always existed in your earthly form throughout all of time either. And so it's sort of like from that point in time forward, you're outside of time. It's a weird way of thinking about it, but holy crap, it's snowing outside right now.
Yeah, but
God, I hate New York so much. I hate the weather here. It's so bad. I wish I was in Florida. Sorry, that's a big tangent, but I'm just noticing it right now.
But do you understand how non-believers see death then?
Yeah, it's kind of, at least
it is.
If you're a
pre-existence.
It kind of would go back to a Pascal's wager sort of thing then, where like, even if you don't believe, but you kind of live your life as if there is a God, or even like, I guess this is sort of the Jordan Peterson method of it. You still got the.
Yeah, I think Pascal wager is some cookery, but yeah, sure.
Like, I'd never argue on the basis of Pascal's wager with someone. Like, I wouldn't tell somebody to convert because of Pascal's wager at all.
Yeah, cucky.
But it.
Like, just give up your ideals. Give up your identity, give up everything, because you don't know, you could know, maybe you're wrong. It's like, fuck off. It's such a weird. Maybe I'm wrong. What a guy.
I don't like the appeal to sort of like the chance.
Yeah.
Because it's much better to make it so that it's like you're certain you're banking on the truth of.
Yeah, exactly.
It is a weak when I make an argument, it's banking on the idea that what I'm saying is true and immovable, as opposed to the idea that, well, we all could be wrong, and in the off chance that we're all wrong, it's just better to believe what I believe anyway, because it'll have the best outcome.
I mean,
which is like,
yeah, and I do prefer the idea that if you believe in something to be true, you stick with it.
Yeah, as opposed to the idea where, well, I could be wrong, but even if I am, there's still a chance that, you know, believing in what I do is going to have a better outcome for you.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. In the end of the day, it will probably. Because it... Again, whatever happens, but it's better, percentage-wise, I think, to just stick with your guts than to be a cuck to another one. Because if there is a God, then he will know you cucked just for the security of going to heaven. It's like, yeah, that's not a virtuous thing to do.
It's not the best thing. I mean, it's not that there's nothing to Pascal's wager in the idea that, like, faking it till you make it it doesn't have no merit. It's just not the optimal way. Like, there's a reason
it's not virtuous.
Like, there are people you could say who might be in heaven right now. Like, as an American, even as an American Catholic, you could say, oh, I believe George Washington is probably in heaven right now. And that's, you know, that's fine, even though he wasn't a Catholic. But the Catholic Church isn't going to go out of its way to canonize George Washington because, I mean, I don't know his specific denomination. I believe he was some kind of Anglican. But the church isn't going to go out of its way to canonize him because even if he did get to heaven, he kind of did it in sort of the non-optimal way, is I guess how I would put it. And so the church doesn't want to promote that because, you know, even though you could get to that heaven in the non-optimal way, there's a chance for a great amount of pitfall along the way. And so why would you promote a path that's not really the right one when you could just promote the right one in the first place? It's sort of a similar line to thinking in that sense.
Yeah. I'm still a boy that likes to say, I don't know.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think even, Whatchamacallit, I think there have been a great many saints who have had, you know, doubts about if what they were doing is true and good. I mean, I think Zizek has made the point, and maybe he was just quoting Kierkegaard, I'm not quite sure, but, like, you know, the truly, you know, the true follower of, like, Christ and, like, you know, the true saint is one who's always, like, doubting their mission and is always unsure.
And doing a leap of faith.
Yeah, and believes anyway. And it's like, it's like one of those things where there's nothing to it, but at the same time, it's like, no, you can be very, very sure that what you're doing is right and be very, very right in your beliefs as a Christian.
And still question.
And yeah, I mean, you could still question it, but even if you don't, like, if you're a Christian who goes throughout their entire life and never questions anything and is just like, well, no, I believe steadfastly and nothing is really going to shake me from my faith, like, that's a noble quality in itself. You know, that's a good way of doing it too. That's probably the better way of doing it, in fact, I'd say. But you know, the people who have doubts aren't wrong either. It's just that, you know, there's optimal ways and there are ways that are less optimal. But if they result in the same thing, it's not the worst.
All right. To the other topic then. That's the first sentence in that first objection. God. I do enjoy Thomas, like this one. I enjoy Summer. Like, I have no issue with it. Except it's outdated and some of the arguments are shit, but it's still an attempt. It's an attempt.
Yeah.
It says, like, it seems that God does not exist because if it does, two contraries be infinite. So it's like the paradoxical concept of God. And I've actually thought of this one a lot. So because God can't be fully one thing, like, he can't be fully good and then evil exists, or that's one, but there's other paradoxes, like in the traits of God. But the lovely thing about that, and I do I have thought about that quite a lot. And if you read the Bible, I had a lot of conversations about the thrones recently and the sherms, the angels, that is. And it's like God exists in a completely another realm, exists in a second realm of sorts. And these in Ezekiel's vision, he saw these 8 creatures, but 4 creatures with 4 heads, and 4 creatures which are wheels. But wheels that also goes in each other. But the point But the point of these are sort of like they're the in between, like they're visible to you in sort of a representation of what they are on the other side, but they're technically also on the other side, because these are wheels that can go in any direction, also into this other realm that the Father is in. So
yeah, right.
So with those concepts, I can start to understand the traits a bit more. But I also thought about I was drunk once, and I thought of the ontological argument, and I was thinking about like, like how can someone think of because humans can think of this this sort of entity that we can't even explain. Therefore, the entity, whatever. But the interesting part about that, and I usually think you can't actually write down all of God's traits in a piece of paper.
Yeah, a good metaphor I heard for it, a good one that classical theist again pointed out to me, was the metaphor of the burning bush. Whereas God, is the burning bush in that, and if you think of the burning bush like the universe, like God is, the universe in sort of all its materiality, but at the same time, he is the burning light that subsumes all of it. And so there is, a separation of sort of the two parts. It's not like a pantheistic kind of sense, but he gives it a light and a greatness that it isn't achievable on its own, because it is all sort of they're all sorts of parts of him, but at lower levels of, I guess, what Thomas Aquinas himself would call act, or existence, and things like that. Like, obviously, the ontological difference between you and me and a rock is, vast, and because like a rock literally can't comprehend anything because it's literally just matter.
Yeah.
Whereas, and it's almost, and the gap between us and God, I guess,
will be in the same way, but not fully. But ants in comparison to human.
Yeah, it's sort of like when a lot of people bring up, aliens that might potentially visit Earth. And it's like, well, these aliens, we think we can make contact with them, but what if to those aliens we're just ants and we're just like mindless little insects, and there's nothing, we can do to stop them from, just screwing with us and putting us in the little glass homes and whatever, because to them we are just ants. And it's sort of a similar sense to God, except, ants can't comprehend us. They can't very well comprehend themselves. We can, comprehend the above and the below, which makes us sort of, the unique middle ground, which is why we're like his perfect creation, where it's like we have been situated, to in the material world to comprehend both it, that which is below us, and, the divine, the quote unquote sort of Platonic world of forms that, he sort of inhabits and is simultaneously. And so even though he is infinite, what we're seeing is different finite expressions of the infinite. It's almost like saying, you have this set of all numbers possible, like whether it's like 0.00000 100 million zeros 1, and the set that includes 2, and everything in between, rational and irrational. And then you just have the set of integers from 1 to 10. Like, that set is obviously a part of the set of all possible numbers, but it is not the set of all possible numbers. It is just a part of it. And it's sort of like the same way with God's existence, where it is the universe itself in its materiality is just taking parts of that infinite, and we are just perceiving those finite parts because we are ourselves, as we exist right now, are finite expressions of it, at least for at this moment.
I get you. I was also while I was drunk that night and was thinking about ontological evidence. It again writing the essence of God, like God, because I always pointed out that there is an importance in writing God with the big G, and not a God with a small G, because the small G God doesn't have the traits of the big G God. The big G God is supposed to be the one with the infinite traits, more or less, with the paradoxical traits. But I was thinking that's actually not the full God either, because if I'm gonna write, like if you're let's say this, you're in the Indiana Jones movie, you have put the crystal head on the alien, and you get one free wish, and your free wish is to write God on a piece of paper, the essence, like what God is on a piece of paper. And if they write like they write it down and say God, but the what would be on the piece of paper would have been 400, 500, 600 dimensional. It would blow your mind just seeing it, because
it's kind of like the wish, like the Russian woman made anyway. It's like, I wish to know it all, and then she just like disintegrates into nothing. It's because it's like, you can't handle the truth, bitch. Like,
no, you can't handle everything. It's too much.
Yeah, because, and I mean,
it's just paradoxical in your own brain. It's like, it's too much.
Was that clicking noise you?
Yeah. Speaking.
No, it's good.
Yes, yeah, no. Speaking like I don't know, Inuits. Speaks like that. I don't know.
Is it like a
Zulu?
Is it like an African tribe, or is it like a Southeast Asian, like Polynesian type tribe? I forget who does the clicking.
Yeah, I know the Zulus also does something like that. Click. That.
Okay.
Yeah, they even have that in the name. I don't speak their language. I just do that. But yeah, it's like, and that's the point of that again, I disagree with ontological, that even that the concept that we have created is actually that supreme. It's fully something that humans could create, regardless. That's my own take on it. But it's an interesting thought experiment, but it's definitely not evidence for anything. It's just evidence that humans' brains are very creative.
Well, I mean, I think, like, you're talking about, like, the argument of sort of like Saint Anselm, right? Where, like, if we think
Anselm.
The perfect island exists, and then it must exist, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I disagree with it. Again, I think it's a very interesting thought experiment, and some parts of me could say, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but no.
I think the argument, perhaps better made, might be that it has more to do with kind of like objectivity than like the idea of there being perfection. Because I mean, like, we all know what a triangle is, but if there isn't some form of triangularity upon which we base the triangle, well then how do we know it really is a triangle? How do we know what really is anything if there aren't, you know, perfect idealized versions of these things that we think of? And if they don't really exist, like, then can we say that any of their, you know, substrates really, any of their subcategories exist really either?
So Platonic, like Plato. That's the only thing I'm hearing when you're saying that. But I'm also thinking like that's the concept of language as well. Like there's language theory around this in particular as well. It's like what is a stool? Like no, if we say the word stool,
are you about to go full Derrida on me?
Then we have like the perfect concept, the perfect idea of a stool that a rational man can think of. Therefore, we can define it as a stool because there's an ideal version of what a stool should look like. Therefore, we can use that word to describe stool. That's gay as fuck. I'm a Wittgenstein all the way, baby. Oof.
Boo. Boo.
Yeah, no, I'm fully Wittgenstein.
Reading Wittgen, you might as well just be jerking off over a dictionary instead of reading like fucking, what is it, Tragico Logicus, whatever the hell it is.
Yeah, Tragicus Logicus.
fucking Latin garble. That's his worst offense. Not that he wrote meaningless philosophy, but that is like
it was not meaningless.
the title of his book is just like this Latin gobbledygook that he just made it to sound important. That's his worst crime.
I mean, he's extreme. He has fucking Asperger's. It's extremely autistic. But not so much the book itself; it's more the points he made it in. Because,
honestly,
I mean, the dude. I think the reason why I like Wittgenstein, I like this. I really like autistic people. I don't know. I just deal with them really well. And Wittgenstein is one of those artists I would do well with. And it's like, but it reminds me of Kurt a lot. The same type of autism. Because Wittgenstein believed when he was done with his tractors that philosophy was over. He fixed philosophy. And that reminds you of Kurt? Yeah.
That reminds me a lot of Kurt, yes.
Yeah. Same autism.
I have to say I haven't seen much of him simply because he has me blocked, and of course, who even cares about propertarianism anymore? But
a lot of people do. It's actually quite large by now.
Oof.
I mean, I guess I don't. Look, I don't know your number, of course, but I mean
we're growing quite a lot.
What's his name? Is Funko Pop motorbike head guy still doing videos? What's his name?
Funko Pop motorhead guy, John Mark.
John Mark, yeah, with the bike helmet and everything.
He is.
I mean, look, it's again, not that I disagree so much with the points of propertarianism, of course. It's always been that, of course, what Kurt's selling, I think, is somewhat incomprehensible in the same way that Wittgenstein, is kind of selling incomprehensible garbage.
And again, I think this has mostly to do with personality. Like, you don't like Wittgenstein for the gobbledygook. Kurt is also filled with gobbledygook. There's a lot of importance in it, but if you don't like to go through gobbledygook, then yeah. And I don't blame you. Again, I genuinely don't blame you because I fully understand you.
No, yeah, I mean...
But again, I enjoy fucking artists.
Yes. You enjoy fucking artists?
Hey, no, hey.
I didn't realize that was Gary Pay.
Oof. Oof. No, but, I mean, no, I enjoy them. I am a Todd Wrangler, after all. Keeping all the autistic prop boys at bay.
I suppose that'd be somewhat interesting in just hearing the arguments again, because I haven't gone over. I still have my conversation with Kurt.
I do want you to have, like, you can come on for a little bit, because I do want you to argue the first mover principle with somebody, because we had a discussion like 5 days ago about the first mover.
Oh, okay.
I tried to argue for the first mover because I'm not into the first mover argument. I find it also weak because it's like, you don't know. It's way too much on faith. The concept of the first mover. So I don't enjoy it, but because there's no, again, I've never had any satisfying answers to it. So, but he had an argument that was really good. It was more of a, he didn't call it logical positivism. It was not positivism, but it was what the fuck is it called?
I don't know.
Anyways, but this would be an interesting debate.
Is Kurt kind of a positivist though? Like looking
not
back
fully,
on it?
but it's close. It's close to it, but he's not.
Yeah, I mean,
but it's kind of interesting how sometimes we go into those realms. We're not something else, fucking philosophy word games, but it goes into it sometimes.
I'd love to see you guys. I'd love to hear Kurt and you and whoever else react to. Where did I put this book? It's a book by Horkheimer. Well, actually, it'd be 2 books. It's Critical Theory, selected essays by him, and then also Frederick Jameson's Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. Both of which I think have very interesting critiques of not just liberal positivism, but sort of positivism in general, and the idea by which, which measuring stick you're sort of using as the basis of your morality. Because, it's not like a lot of people. I had this conversation with someone Adam Friended had on a little while ago about, like, which measuring stick you're using to sort of get your morality from. And in the sense that he was talking about, it's just like, oh, well, it's like, a lot of people say it's like, oh, well, do you want peace? Do you want order? And like things like that. Well, then you have to believe what I believe. Otherwise, you'll never get that. And I'm like, well, like, dude, make the case why people should want peace and order. Like, why are those good things? What is your definition of good to begin with? And why should we strive towards it? And in that sort of sense, that's sort of where the conversation stops. It starts with like this assumption of what good is, and then
you give me flashbacks to our little debates, which you went deconstruction postmodernistic, and it's like, yes, that's so disgusting to do. Because again, you might not believe it, but I can deconstruct your God as well. For many, but it's like, but because you believe in it, you have that strong suit for you because you believe in God yourself. While in the argument itself, it will be deconstructed, but for you, there's a wall there because you believe, so it won't be deconstructed. But for the inside of the argument and for the people listening, he can still be deconstructed. And again, this is why I don't like postmodern deconstructionism. It's like, it's like, you can do that to anything. You can genuinely rationalize away everything. That's not the point.
The positivist fears the Chad postmodernist.
But I did like that quote from a right-wing monarchist back in the day. It's like. It was even long before postmodernism. He kind of already figured out it's going to happen. He's like, you can, like, I was questioning pretty much verbatim. Obviously, they spoke more beautifully than I do now, but it's like, of course, monarchism is stupid. Of course, everything is fucking stupid. You can rationalize away everything. You can look at everything and you can make it just be silly. Because even the sense of eating can be silly. You're eating an egg, that's so silly. That's menstruation. That's so silly. It's like, but even with the silliness, there is still... Like, his point was that there is the reason behind things to exist, even though it looks silly. Even though they are silly. You can go on and on and on and on and on and on and call everything silly.
Well, I mean, that would be the conversation for another... Like,
but it's not a conversation worth having.
How can you deconstruct it?
That's a long debate though. It can be a book. It could be a book. But no, I'm not a theologian, and I don't like that type of stuff. I like discussing it, like friendly discussions, but again, I'm not a theologian. I do sociology, psychology. I don't do theology. I suck at it. I genuinely suck at it. Because I was never that type of Christian. I was never into theology. Because I was a Lutheran cuck who was like into personal relationship with God, not so much theology of God. So, and I know myself, I didn't I wasn't much of a Jesus freak at all. I never really... I was more of a Unitarian as a kid, to be honest, than believing in Jesus Christ. Because I believed there was a Father out there, sort of God looking at me, helping me, being there for me. So, again, personal God. But it was never, Jesus of Nazareth. But,
so sort of a more general deistic perspective then.
Yes, but it will, because... I did believe in the Holy Spirit, though. Again, I guess that's my Lutheran concept. But then I always found a lot of stories about Jesus silly. I went to churches many times as a kid, and it's like, it's so silly. It's like, again, everything is silly. You can call everything silly. I mean, as I usually say, Christianity is one of the most fucked up religions ever. If you have no context clue of it before, you go into a church and what do you see? You see a fucking dead man hanging. You're like, what the fuck is this? Like barbaric religion.
Yeah, I mean, that's how the Romans tried to sell it too.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah, but again,
it's
if
like
it is silly.
Sorry, I was just gonna say all fedora tip criticisms of Christ.
Yeah, well, maybe the Romans back in the day. Oh, all right, you died off somehow.
I should say.
Oh, now you're back.
Mm.
You died off. Yeah, you died off a bit.
Okay. I was just saying all modern fedora tip criticisms are basically just rehashed anti-Christian edicts.
Yeah.
And they've just taken new form.
Oh, actually, mine is dying. Oh.
What's up?
My thing is dying, actually.
Okay.
Alright, I guess it died there. What's happening here?
Wait, shit, is the live stream still going? I haven't checked in a sec.
I don't think I don't know. No, it should be live, but it's not taking in material. It's being derpy now.
Oh.
We've gone on for like 1 hour 30 minutes. Don't know what happened.
Okay, yeah, we're still on.
Oh, we're still on. All right. So weird.
Oh, there's one fedora tip comment somewhat to the in the chat that I will just address briefly, and then maybe we could call it. But
sure.
Someone was saying, if there is a God, small g, in a universe where other human-like beings could exist, why would it tailor texts, prophets, and miracles for us only, and mostly at historically receptive times? I can't believe. First off, yes, other beings could potentially exist. We don't really have reason to believe that they do. I mean, after all, the universe is 12 billion years old, and it took at least 4 billion for us to get here. I mean, how many billions of years did it take for the planets to form even? And then have planets end up in Goldilocks regions? Like, how much quicker could it have happened than us? But even disregarding sort of that sort of element of it where, like, things sort of had to fall into place for it to happen. Obviously, I mean...
would validate, if you really think about it.
Sorry?
It wouldn't really invalidate the existence of a god anyway.
Yeah, I mean, even if there are other beings, I mean, perhaps we are special. Like, we haven't been reasoned to
but
be...
I do think it goes back to the last question I would have, actually, before we end this. And that is...
okay, sure.
That is the second objection. It's quicker on whether God exists. Because it's kind of what Ospin is pointing at a tiny bit. So, objection 2, let me read it here. Further, it is, I don't know how the fuck to pronounce that word, superfluous, to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there's no supposed God's existence. There's no need to suppose God's existence because it's not needed. We have nature and we have will. Those can exist without God, therefore not God. And this is kind of the point here. He's speaking out more of a necessity of, like, this is not necessary for me. Why should I do this? Because I don't need it. Everything that is necessary is already there. Why should I believe in your God?
Mm-hmm. I get you.
It goes back to that. But the thing with that is, it's regardless of your, and this is, if you debate I don't fully agree with him either. The first move principle, you're gonna go back to this argument again because it's not beneficiary, therefore I shouldn't do it. But that does not mean it's not true. As I usually say to these people, there's still a possibility of a metaphysical truth We don't know what it is. But there's still a possibility of it. And that might be God. Just because it's not enough for your survival, or you haven't observed it yet, does not mean there is no God.
Yeah, it's sort of
Because, I mean, in the end of the day, isn't that the black swan concept? That you believe that there is no God because every swan is white. Because every swan is white, there is no God. But once you start to see a black swan, that is God. Like, you know, you get the point.
Yeah, and it's sort of, you know, to say, I mean, to even go further than that, to say, you know, nature and reason are suffice sort of presupposes the idea that they kind of just showed up and... Am I breaking up?
No, yeah. Are you breaking up?
Okay. It says, "Oh no, a big red bar. Your connection is struggling," but it keeps.
All right, we should end it soon. We should end it pretty much. Just say your last point here.
No, it's just that at the end of the day, the reason I think God's essence is sort of inescapable and so vast is because it is a fundamental essence of existence itself. And because we have revelation and things added to it, that muddies the water somewhat and makes it sort of harder to believe, but there does need to be some fundamental essence to existence. Like, there does have to be, if not a reason, a cause for existence. You know, yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, maybe it isn't a personal God, but there is a.
The principle of significant reasoning, right here, because it exists, there must be a cause.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very hard, and that's another conversation. But I think that's very hard to kind of just argue against and whatnot. I think it's a slippery slope downward of what you're willing to accept, and then from there, what conclusions you could actually come to about, you know, what is and isn't okay to do as people, and what we are as people in the first place.
Yeah. All right. Any last words then before I end?
No, it was good. It was good to talk about these things. I haven't done it in a while.
I'm glad.
Good chat.
We can talk again. We can talk about quite a lot more, but we've been on this for 1 hour and 40 minutes. That's good enough for one sitting. Thank you, Prag. By the way, it was fun. It was fun.
Yes.
And I'm glad we're not battling it with Ray. Because I don't enjoy debates. I've never enjoyed debates.
I too like, you know, the healthy conversation. Perhaps, you know, I've never ruled anything out with her at all. So perhaps.
I'm not come back. I just mean the debates we had.
Oh yes, well she was never the worst of it. It was always fucking. I haven't heard of this. Oh God, I haven't. What's his?
We should end this before we talk shit and gossip.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. It was very fun.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.